that so? You read about them once, you'll see. Look at Henry the Eighth. This'n is a Sunday school superintendent to him. And look at Charles Second, and Louis 14, and Louis 15, and James Second, and Edward Second, and Richard Third, and 40 more, besides all them Saxton heptarchies that used to rip around so in old times and raise Cain. My, you ought to see old Henry the Eighth when he was in bloom. He was a blossom. He used to marry a new wife every day and chop off her head next morning, and he would do it just as indifferent as if he was ordering up eggs. Fetch up Nell Gwynn, he says. They fetch her up. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Fetch up Jane Shore, he says, and up she comes. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Bring up Fair Rosamond. Fair Rosamond answers the bell. Next morning, chop off her head. And he made every one of them tell him a tale every night, and he kept that up till he had hogged 1,001 tales that way, and then he put them all in a book, and called it Doomsday Book, which was a good name, and stated the case. You don't know kings, Jim, but I know them, and this old rip of ourn is one of the cleanest I've struck in history. Well, Henry, he takes a notion he wants to get up some trouble with this country. How does he go at it? Give notice? Give the country a show? No. All of a sudden, he heaves all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard and whacks out a Declaration of Independence and dares them to come on. That was his style. He never give anybody a chance. He had suspicions of his father, the Duke of Wellington. Well, what did he do? Ask him to show up? No. Drownded him in a butt of Mamsie, like a cat. Suppose people left money laying around where he was. What did he do? He collared it. Suppose he contracted to do a thing and you paid him and didn't sit down there and see that he done it. What did he do? He always done the other thing. Suppose he opened his mouth. What then? If he didn't shut it up powerful quick, he'd lose a lie every time. That's a kind of a bug, Henry was, and if we'd had him along 'stead of our kings, he'd have fooled that town a heap worse than ourn done. I don't say that ourn is lambs, because they ain't, when you come right down to the cold facts, but they ain't nothing to that old ram anyway. All I say is, kings is kings, and you got to make allowances. Take them all round, they're a mighty ornery lot. It's the way they're raised. But this one do smell so like damnation, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History don't tell no way. Now, the Duke, he's a tolerable likely man in some ways. Yes, the Duke's different, but not very different. This one's a middlin' hard lot for a Duke. When he's drunk, there ain't no nearsighted man could tell him from a king. Well, anyways, I don't hanker for no more'n 'em, Hook. These is all I can stand. It's the way I feel too, Jim, but we've got them on our hands, and we got to remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could hear of a country that's out of kings. What was the use to tell Jim these warn't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done no good, and besides, it was just as I said. You couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often done that. When I waked up, just at daybreak, he was sitting there with his head down betwixt his knees, moaning and mourning to himself. I didn't take notice nor let on. I knowed what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick, because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life, and I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for their'n. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moaning and mourning that way nights when he judged I was asleep, and saying, "Po' little Elizabeth, po' little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I speck I ain't ever gwine to see you no mo', no mo'." He was a mighty good nigger, Jim was. But this time I somehow got to talking to him about his wife and young ones, and by he says, "What makes me feel so bad dis time is because I hear somepin over yonder on de bank like a whack or a slam, while ago, and it mind me er de time I treat my little Lizabeth so ornery. She warn't only 'bout 4 year old, and she took de scarlet fever, and had a powerful rough spell, but she got well, and one day she was a-standin' round, and I says to her, I says, 'Shut de door.' She never done it, just stood dere, kinder smilin' up at me. It made me mad, and I says again, mighty loud, I says, 'Don't you hear me? Shut de door.' She just stood the same way, kinder smilin' up. I was a-bilin'. I says, 'I lay I make you mine.' And wid dat I fetch her a slap side de head dat sent her a-sprawlin'. Den I went into de other room, and is gone 'bout 10 minutes, and when I come back, dere was dat door standin' open yit, and dat child standin' most right in it, a-lookin' down and mournin', and de tears runnin' down. My, but I was mad. I was a-gwine for de child, but just den, it was the door dat opened innards. Just den, 'long come de wind and slam it to behind de child. Kerblam! And my land, de child never move. My breath most hop outer me, and I feel so, I don't know how I feel. I crope out all a-tremblin', and crope around and open de door easy and slow, and poke my head in behind de child, soft and still, and all of a sudden I says, 'Pow!' just as loud as I could yell. She never budge. Oh, Huck, I bust